Um, Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Shinichi Kitaoka, to be a moderator in this session, session 4, the Portsmouth Treaty and Asia-Pacific relations today. I am sorry for my late participation. I just arrived at this lunchtime because I was planning to come yesterday, but I had one wisdom tooth extracted the day before, and then I have still some pain and sweating here. So I was wondering if I should be in the photograph or not. But anyhow, today we have two presenters. And then because I had an announcement from Stephen that there will be an opening of Orozco part of museum, which is an excellent possession of this university, I think. So many people are interested in it very much, I think. So upon the suggestion from Stephen, I'd like to adjourn this meeting 5 minutes before 3. So is it okay? So let's directly get into the presentation. Now I will give the floor to David.
Thank you very much, Kitaoka-sensei. First of all, I'd like to make a couple of minor corrections to the program. Double title change. First, a change in the title of my paper, which no longer reads Portsmouth Power Projection and Northeast Asian Anti-Americanism, but now reads Portsmouth Regionalism and Northeast Asian Anti-Americanism. And secondly, I'd like to make the second title change in my own title, because even though it says I'm an independent scholar, it says something quite different on the list of participants. I've been at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington since 1997. We're bipartisan, but that doesn't mean we're independent. That much said. This, of course, was an extremely difficult task, I found, to relate the Portsmouth Treaty to Asia-Pacific relations today. 100 years have gone by, 100 years in a couple of days. And I went back and I got a copy of the treaty and I looked through the 15 articles, and basically none of them are valid anymore. None of them have any standing anymore. Maybe the one about fisheries has some standing. So you couldn't really do it as sort of a textual exercise, you know, the way we learned to do explication de texte, where you just take the text and you track it forward. I was in Japan this year for most of the year, working on Russo-Japanese war-related endeavors. And in the course of being there, I did what you can do in Japan and very few other places. I met someone who was over 100 years old, because there's over 10,000 people now in Japan who are over 100 years old. And I met this person who is a distant relative of my wife's, and she was barely there. She lit up for a minute and was there, but she was barely there. And in that sense, maybe the Portsmouth Treaty is also just barely there. I don't mean that in any disrespectful way, but 100 years is a long time. I also discovered, while I was there, a brewery in Akita-ken up north that's producing a sake called Hyakunen Mai, 100-year-old sake. And of course, the sake is not 100 years old because they put a tax on sake at the time of the Russo-Japanese War, aged sake, and everybody, rather than pay the tax, drank it up. And ever since then, they don't do aged sake so much in Japan. So much for patriotism. In any case, the yeast that's used to ferment this sake, because sake is a fermented liquor, is over 100 years old, the actual koji that's used in it. And I wanted to pass it around, anyone who's interested. No, they can't take a sip. But there's a little article attached as well. The Yomiuri, which was one of our sponsors in Japan, did a short blurb on it, they being believers in tradition. But I wanted to just pass that around so people could have a look at that. Once again, It's barely sake. It's 100 years old. You drink this stuff, it doesn't taste like any other sake you've ever tasted. It's sort of halfway between sake and umeshu, if you can imagine what that is. But in any case, it's not sake anymore. 100 years has caused serious changes in the taste of everything and the meaning of everything and the context of everything. So this was rather a difficult task. When did I start? Nampun.
About 10 minutes ago?
No. Good night.
5 minutes have passed.
5 minutes have passed. Thank you.
10 minutes left.
10 minutes left. Thank you. However, I took courage. I took courage from Professor Irie's keynote speech at our conference at Keio University in May, where at the level of the key isms of the 20th century, he successfully, I believe, related what happened in the Russo-Japanese War to the present. And I use that to some extent as the centerpiece, as the third part of my paper. This is a paper in 3 parts. Unlike everyone else who has said, my paper is a work in progress, my paper is 3 works in progress, so it's even a little more disorganized. The first section is a kind of taxonomy of the transmission of historical lessons, in which I divide them into 2 kinds. One I call constructive, and the other I call constructed. We could call them something else, but those are the 2 kinds, and of course I'll take questions on those if there's an interest. And the second section, I looked at what it would look like if we actually tried to write a Northeast Asian regional history of the Portsmouth Treaty by looking specifically at the deep dissatisfaction of every single one of the players other than the United States, which at that time is not really considered Northeast Asia. But certainly Japan is not happy with the results. We just posed in front of a picture where, if you read carefully the print on 8 September 1905, Portsmouth Herald, it said, "The populace has shown anger against Americans and violent enmity towards Christians. Harriman party attacked." Clearly, Japan was not happy with the treaty, although certain statesmen understood why it was necessary. And certainly all those boys who didn't die, they were happy, even if they didn't realize they should be happy. The Russians, of course, were unhappy with losing territory. Vitya was happy, of course, because he understood that he had pulled off a coup. The Chinese were deeply unhappy. They had asked the Americans to invite them to the Portsmouth Treaty, and the Americans said, decisions about China will be decided later, and left him to the tender mercies of an unhappy Komura, who then met with them in December 1905 after returning from the United States and shoved the Beijing Treaty down their throats. So the Chinese were deeply unhappy, and of course the Koreans, they lost all. That was a lose-all proposition. So everyone who we think of as Northeast Asia, if they look back at this treaty, they're unhappy. And if we were writing a regional history, this would be the beginning moment of anti-Americanism in the region. And then we could build from there if we were going to write such a regional history. It hasn't been written yet, but if there was a regional entity, maybe we'd write a regional history. That's sort of the second part of my paper. The third part of my paper, where I will concentrate my remaining 7 minutes, is it? Is that right? Yeah. My remaining 7 minutes speaks to the issue of the actual creation of some kind of a regional entity. Looking at Northeast Asia, what are our chances for creating a regional entity? And what are some of the positive factors in that direction? What are some of the negative factors in that direction? And what do they have to do with the Portsmouth Peace Treaty? Generally, there's been, I quote 2 recent works by Gilbert Rosman at Princeton University and Edward Lincoln, who's both at the Council on Foreign Relations and at the International Institute of Economics, I think it's called, in Washington, which is sort of a branch of the Council of Foreign Relations. And they both analyze Northeast Asian regionalism and say, how can it be that despite this incredible economic growth in the region, nonetheless, there's no kind of institution that's congealing, How can this be? And there, Gil Rosman has coined the phrase "stunted regionalism" to refer to this. And I'd like to sort of try to draw out what I see as some of the reasons why it's not working. By the way, there's a lot of hopes that the six-party talks, which are about to reconvene, are they about to reconvene? They're about to reconvene in Beijing, may eventually turn into the kernel of such an organization. So there's sort of bright hopes attached to that as we make a last desperate attempt to keep the arms race from spiraling out of control in Northeast Asia. Probably the main reason why there's hope for regionalism in Northeast Asia is because of that very arms race which is taking place there. Kent Calder wrote an excellent book about 10 years ago, and everything has just gotten worse since then. It's definitely the most arms racing place on the planet at the moment. Everyone talks about Chinese military modernization, but right behind them in all respects is Japan and the United States, who are sort of matching and coming up with all kinds of bright new ideas. And of course, the upgrade in weaponry that the North Koreans have been putting into place has drawn everybody's attention. Why do we have this arms race going on? And as I argue in the paper, it's because there are unfinished pieces of the Cold War in Northeast Asia. You get your choice to define what the Cold War is. But if you thought that the Cold War was about communist governments, well, you've got communist governments in this region. The Soviet Union is gone, but China is still run by the Chinese Communist Party. If you think it was about divided countries and uniting Germany entered the Cold War, if the Berlin Wall moment is your moment, you still have those divided countries in Northeast Asia. You have both China divided and you have Korea divided. And if you think it's about arms race, which is the way the Soviets always defined it, then, well, you have arms race as well. So the reason why you have instability and are unable to have an institution is because the Cold War is still ongoing there, and no one's really found a way to sort of bridge the divide of the Cold War to create a regional institution, I would argue. Positive potential energy. Korea, after 100 years, is poised to return to the map as a unified, independent country. Poised, there's still one big step, but it's just one big step. And everyone hesitates in front of that big step because we haven't seen Korea in this guise for 100 years, and no one's really thought through all of the ramifications of what it'll mean. It's almost too big for everyone to think it all through. And this is something that comes directly from the Portsmouth Treaty. Secondly, another positive moment is China. China is an almost inexhaustible engine of growth, provided with enough resources, which of course is a big issue for them. 1.3 billion manpower engine ready to fuel this region and make some kind of regional unity prosperous. Everyone who hooks up to that engine will make money. I just came from Shanghai a little while ago, and what the market did for Shanghai is just incredible. I lived there 20 years ago, and it's just not the city it was anymore. Everybody walks faster. Only the market can make 20 million people all walk faster. So this is a very positive thing, if it's viewed positively. And Japan, which is the third piece at the core of Northeast Asia, China, Korea, Japan. Japan is also on the verge of very big changes. We're going to have an election in Japan tomorrow? Tomorrow we're going to have an election in Japan. Everyone is voting for reform. Everyone who's campaigning says, no, we have the reform. Everybody knows that what the voters want is a reform. Japan hasn't changed its constitution in 50 years. It's like the longest lasting constitution without a change on the planet. They're overdue for change. Everyone's a little concerned about what kind of change, but they're overdue for change. Japan is on the verge, And of course, that makes everyone nervous also. So we have three big moments of potential energy. And I'll relate them all back to the Portsmouth Treaty if people actually ask me that question later, but I won't take the time because I know the time's going to run out on me. I want to say a few things about the minuses, the real problems, the structural problems in trying to reach regional entity. The first is one that my colleague Alexei Bogaturov knows well and has written greatly on. It's the issue of well, it's not just Russia, but he's written about the Russian Far East in this regard, that Russia, Moscow always has to balance. It wants to be part of this entity. It deeply wants to be part of whatever is formed in Northeast Asia. On the other hand, it has to be very careful that as the Russian Far East joins this region, because that's the part that would join, that this doesn't lead either to separatist tendencies, as it has in the past, or to criminal tendencies that are masked by cross-border trade and cross-border relations. And therefore, Moscow is ambivalent about the process, and it's sort of always putting the brakes on. It can't let the process go. To be quite honest, the Chinese have similar concerns for the Chinese Northeast as well, and it's one of the reasons that they've let the Chinese Northeast continue as a rust belt. They haven't let it develop the way so many other parts of China have developed. So there's that double face of regionalism, that regionalism can be a macro, a transnational entity, and it can also be a subnational entity. It's an ambiguity in the term itself, region and regionalism, and they are related. If you have those transnational entities, it means that pieces of your country will be more involved in the transnational entity rather than all of your country, with the possible exception of Korea, which would be plop in the middle of it. Finally, there's the issue of nationalism, which was certainly one of Professor Idie's big isms when he led off that conference in May in Tokyo. And he spoke, I thought, very perceptibly about the fact that at the birth of the great nationalisms in Northeast Asia, and we're looking at the moment of birth with the Russo-Japanese War, it's just a little bit earlier for Chinese nationalism. Most people would date it to the Russian occupation of Manchuria, maybe to the Boxer Rebellion, but we're really talking about it coming together at this moment of war and peace, clustered around the Portsmouth Treaty. And of course, the Korea has no real nationalism until Korea is eliminated as a country, and then nationalism really takes off. Nobody knew what to do with it at that time, and nobody knew what to do with their own nationalisms that they had provoked in order to fight the war. The Japanese didn't know what to do when the government, when it faced the Hibiya riots, which was something that it itself had provoked by stoking nationalism during the war. We still have this issue. This is a direct continuity to the Portsmouth Treaty. The Yasukuni Shrine issue, which rose again this spring, and complicated relations not only between Japan and China, but between Japan and Korea and Japan and Singapore. And basically, once again, whatever small fibers had managed to tie together, it sort of tore them all apart a little bit again. This issue continues as large as it was before. I won't go into the details about the anti-American regional version. I can certainly say more about that, but there's plenty in the paper. A couple final lessons maybe to be drawn from the Portsmouth Treaty as we move forward to try to accomplish region in Northeast Asia. Japan rose in the eyes of the world with this war. Countries do go up and down, and everyone should be ready for countries to go up and down. You can't sort of stay in the position forever, especially dealing with this kind of dynamic process. Secondly, we need to avoid the creation of spoilers in the region. We need to not exclude anyone from the process, because anyone who's excluded from the process will be in a position to spoil the region for everyone else. I'm thinking specifically of the way the Russians were left out of the early negotiations with regard to Korea, and were shut out of CATO, the Korean Energy Development Organization. Russia is certainly the country that's most in danger of being shut out of the process. But certainly the United States should think carefully before allowing that to happen, since the United States is also, to some extent, an outsider in this region. So in any case, Korea and China were left out of the Portsmouth Treaty process. We should make sure that none of the players are left out of the next step in the development of Northeast Asia. And finally, we need to think about the trade-offs between thinking long-term and achieving immediate national advantages. There's always a tendency in the negotiation of any kind of document, and certainly this was true in the case of the Portsmouth document, to think in terms of reaching immediate advantage, possibly earned advantage, rather than thinking about how long you would want this document to last, and therefore forsaking immediate advantage in order to build something a little bit more lasting. I would argue that the exact same kind of vision that's required to think forward to build those kinds of treaties that last a long time, that will make for a peaceful and prosperous Northeast Asia, or a peaceful and prosperous Asia Pacific, if we think in a bigger regional version, is exactly the same kind of historical vision that's needed to do the work we've been doing here, to look back 50, to look back 100 years, and say, how did we get here today? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David. When I was first skimming the two papers I was going to moderate, I was wondering if I could make these two papers into one integrated session. But today you spoke much more about today's contemporary things, so I think we can go ahead in a good manner. One thing I just reminded when I was listening to you is that when I first participated, a conference in here at Dartmouth, last time it was in 1994, in June. It was just in the middle of the political struggle between Hosokawa coalition versus LDP plus socialist parties. So during the conference, the Hatta cabinet fell down, and then there was a battle in the lower house, and we are betting in the Hanover Inn, which will win, Kaifu or Murayama, and I won in that betting, but we betted only $1 each, so I didn't get much money from that. I don't know if we are going to do the same today, tomorrow. Next presenter is Vladimir Ivanov on economic engagement. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kitaoka. I would like, first of all, to say that it's an honor for me to be here, and thank you very much for including me in your group because of the reasons still unknown to me. My challenging task is to ask you to travel, to make a kind of a travel in time from the first decade of the last century to the first decade of this current century. And in that context, I'm really grateful for shifting gears by David, because it makes my task a little bit easier. My closest, somewhat personal association with the Portsmouth event was a recent conference in Osaka, co-organized by Dr. Taro Nakayama, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan, with the help of his constituency near Osaka, and also the Council of National Security. Professor Shigeki Hakamada was the keynote speaker. It was a very interesting event dedicated to the humanitarian issues, primarily the phenomena of the prisoners of war. The Japanese prisoners of war, the relatively small group was residing in the area of St. Petersburg in the small town called Medved. So some people from the local community, including the historical museum, were traveling to Osaka. And also, of course, exactly within the perimeters of Dr. Nakayama's electorate community was another rather big prisoners of war camp, which contained approximately 10,000 Russians. Well, anyway, the second opportunity was given to me by Charles Dolyak a few years ago when we traveled together to the Portsmouth Naval Base, shipyard, in fact. And I think I was very fortunate to have that kind of unique opportunity to have a look at the museum, which is inside the building where the treaty was signed. Upon exiting this building, I saw the copper plate that commemorates this event, and approximately 100 meters from the entrance to this building was a monument, basically the USS submarine, attack submarine, which these submarines were servicing, were undergoing the service at the naval yard probably since 1970s. And of course, as we all know, one of the purposes of these powerful weapons were to trace the Russian submarines in the Sea of Okhotsk, obviously with some support from the Japanese naval self-defense forces. The naval cooperation between the US Navy and the Japanese self-defense forces was the primary component of the military cooperation during those years. And of course, you know very well that at this same place, during the years of the Pacific War, the American submarines were built to fight the Japanese Navy. So it's interesting that we have that kind of free time triangles in one very beautiful spot. And my idea is to try to convince you that today we have a phenomenon of radical shift in paradigm of this relationship, the relationship that includes not only Japan and Russia, but also the United States. And I will try to give you some considerations why I believe this is happening. Well, first of all, for the almost 100 years, the bilateral relationship were always dependent on externalities. And externalities in Russia-Japan relations, whether it was the influence of China or the policy of the United States or the relationship on the Korean Peninsula, were almost always, without any exception, were working against the bilateral interests. Now things changed to the extent that externalities, the way I see them, work in favor of closer relationship between Japan and Russia. I believe also that the bilateral interface, which is not necessarily very well developed, is becoming qualitatively different, and it is more positively focused at any point during the last century. The bilateral agenda is undergoing a significant transformation at three levels. The first is the policy dialogue, which is, I think, is developing, particularly over the last 10, maybe particularly last 5 years, with some contributions from the new Russian leadership. Then investment decisions, which were always the function of the governments on both sides during the Soviet times and also during the time when the new Russia, new post-Soviet Russia was able to get some loans from the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. These decisions were always taken by the governments. Now, the companies like Toyota make their own decisions. And even though these perhaps steps are still modest, it's a good indication that things are developing in a positive direction. And then the third level, of course, is the rapidly increasing grassroots interaction. Travel, commerce, personal ties, student exchanges, medical exchanges. I believe this is the very important to look at these humanitarian contacts as a very new sign in relationship, because until very recently, all these humanitarian contacts again were under the strict control of the governments. now things became more and more independent, more and more kind of non-governmental in nature. Of course, we have to look at the role of the United States in Japan-Russia relations, and this role has changed dramatically. The relationship with NATO which Russia is trying to channel in a very positive direction, are based on the kind of concept of partnership. In this context, the military-to-military dialogue and exchanges between Japan and Russia would be characterized by many people, including the former ambassador to Tokyo, Alexander Panov, as one of the most successful bilateral channels developed since the Russia became Russia, since the fall of the former Soviet Union. We should perhaps also account for the role that G8 group is playing and the relationship that were basically formed between Russian leadership, new Russian leadership, Mr. Putin primarily, and the leaders of the countries like UK, Germany, Italy, France, and other members of the G8. And it created, again, a very unique framework in which the leaders of Japan and Russia must not necessarily plan long ahead bilateral visits. They simply meet and talk during the G8 summits. Next summit, as you know very well, will take place in Moscow, in St. Petersburg next year, focused on energy issues and on some issues of demography. In that respect, both Russia and Japan are undergoing, because of various reasons and different reasons, and the phenomenon of the declining population is qualitatively different in Russia and Japan, but this phenomena is very menacing for both societies, I believe. So according to Mr. Putin, this may be the one point of the discussions during the summit meeting in St. Petersburg. As far as the regional issues are concerned, I would very much agree with David that North Korea being excluded, it's already excluded, but if North Korea will not be integrated into regional relationship in a positive way, of course with some assurances on the part of Pyongyang, North Korea could continue to spoil regional relationship. And in this context, I think Japan and Russia recognized long ago that they have a joint responsibility for contributing to the solution of the North Korean problem. Mr. Putin was playing, as far as I can judge, very instrumental role in helping Mr. Koizumi to visit Pyongyang and helping Japanese abducted citizens to go back to Japan. And I think this is not necessarily a very official part of the agenda, but this is exactly what is happening in the relationship between Japan and Russia with regard to North Korea. The most important is what is going to happen if the six-party talks would lead to some progress. The problem would be, of course, to support the reform in North Korea, to provide North Korea with some means and tools to modernize its infrastructure, to put in order its energy sector, which is in itself a multi-billion task. And both Japan and Russia could play a very significant role in rehabilitating North Korea. But before that, they are already cooperating, persuading North Korea to dismantle its nuclear weapon program. Another example is the participation of Japan in the dismantling of the nuclear arsenal of the former Soviet Union. According to the plan which is currently underway, in the next 5 years, 40 decommissioned nuclear-powered submarines will be disassembled and securely stored, as far as the nuclear components are concerned, with the participation of Japan, with support provided by the Japanese government. Well, in addition, I have to remind you that Japan was assisting Russian application to become a member of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. Japan supports Russian bid for become a member of the WTO. Russia, on the other hand, is supportive of Japan's interest in gaining the status of the permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. I think I will briefly skip some of the issues related to the economics. Certainly, we have to acknowledge that the relationship, as far as trade and investment are concerned, are insufficiently developed. I think Russian side has to accept the prime responsibility, and I think there is no disagreement about it in Moscow or in some other cities in Russia, that the incapacity of Russia to buy more or to encourage more investment is the prime reason. But on the other hand, Russia's economic image is changing, and this image is being carefully monitored in Japan, in Tokyo, as well as in Osaka and other main concentrations of Japanese businesses. According to some estimates, currently, in terms of the investment climate, Russia is ranking 11th economy in the world, close to China. There is a reform in the system of the state management. The tax pressure for the enterprises has been reduced considerably. The government is trying, I think with some consistency, to modernize the financial infrastructure and provide some kind of transparent rules for companies operating in natural resource-based industries. The volume of bilateral trade is not large, particularly by Japanese standards, but it has doubled in the last 7 years. If to account for the imports of Japanese goods produced in other countries or transported to Russia via third countries, Japan is the 5th largest partner, trading partner of Russia. And again, if to account for the investment projects such as Sakhalin projects, Japan would be the 5th largest investor in Russia. We have to again remind ourselves that Russian exports to Japan is of kind of primary nature, but on the other hand, a month ago, 2 Japanese satellites were launched by the Russian space vehicle. So we could not only expect some interdependence in the high-tech sectors, but we already have that kind of interrelationship. The relationship are developing at the level of the prefectural governments, and considering the kind of the new course taken by the Japanese government to provide prefectures with greater autonomy, greater decision-making in order to revitalize Japanese economy, as well as some positive developments on the Russian side. Being a near God, I can see how this relationship are developing, and this is, I think, very important part of the bilateral dialogue. If you will be interested, I can briefly tell you what's going on with the Pacific Pipeline project, but let me tell you this. Japan, of course, is the oil importing country. Russian government took a decision to make a strategic shift from being solely dependent on European oil markets towards diversification in favor of the markets of the United States and Northeast Asia. And by the year 2020, in 15 years from now, the plan is to ship at least 100 million tons of oil to the Pacific markets, including Japan. This is going to be at least 1/3 of the Russian entire oil exports. And I think this, of course, this shift is designed in the context of Russia's national interests, but it so much corresponds with what Japan would like to have in the future, at least the Japanese government would like to have in the future, in the long run, in terms of diversifying its sources of oil supply. And same could be said about natural gas. And I think when we talk about the Pacific Pipeline project, and we normally concentrate on who is going to fund and participate at the construction of the pipe. This is not the most important part of the project. I think the most important part is that Japan and Russia have the unlimited Chinese market to the north, to the south from the Russian border. And with the combination of technologies and resources, natural gas, oil, hydroelectric power, and technologies that Japan mastered to the level to become the first most energy efficient economy in the world, two countries have natural capacity to cooperate and to join forces. And in conclusion, in my opinion, Japan and Russia have entered the age of big mega projects that will define, in my opinion, they are already defining, like Sakhalin projects, for example, the dynamics, the scale, and the nature of relationship and the nature of growing economic interdependence. Part of this interdependence would be created perhaps through the participation in fulfilling the obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. And finally, I would like to say that the future of Northeast Asia, both economic future and strategic stability, depends on the way Russia and Japan will be able to cope with the growing China. And in my view, it is only one way that these two countries could generally cooperate in fulfilling their national interests, long-term aspirations, and that is to promote trilateral cooperation between Russia, Japan, and China. So this triangle should complement the triangle, which is now quite benign as far as we think about US, Japan, and Russia. And we probably have to think what the both Russian and Japanese governments can do in realizing this kind of long-term vision. Finally, my final note is the following. In the year 2004, 1 year ago, Niigata experienced, the prefecture Niigata experienced flood and then the terrible earthquake. And we all feel the consequences of the earthquake until even now, because the main expressway between Niigata and Tokyo is still under the reconstruction work. And I would like to say that what we see over the last 10 days on the CNN and other channels is very, very depressing. I hope that everything goes well, but I believe that we have feel very sorry about it. Thank you.
Would it be possible, in the spirit of the Portsmouth conference, to just tell here for the pool, fresh air, and nature?
Microphone, please. Microphone.
Could you do that? Okay. Thank you for your advice. Thank you very much, Vladimir, for your very sharp analysis of the fundamental changes in that region. And next, I'd like to call upon the discussant, Alexei Bogaturov.
No, he's not here.
He's not here. We can skip him.
No, I'm the only discussant. That's old. He's not speaking
Okay.
on this panel.
So you are on here. Okay. Then, yeah, fortunately, because we are a little bit behind the time, so I would appreciate Mr. Wayne Mary who is a real diplomat, unlike me. I'm an amateur diplomat, you're a professional diplomat. And then you will give a discussion on these two papers. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We've come to the section of this conference where we're sort of looking backwards in order to look forwards, examining the history in order to relate it to current and future policy issues. And this is reflected by the fact that around this table, in what is a very academic setting, we have people from both academic and policy backgrounds. My background being entirely of a policy background in the State Department, and the Pentagon, and the Congress, unlike an academic, I'm allowed to dwell on issues at a somewhat lower level of intellectual rigor than would normally be the case in such a conference. What I want to do is talk a bit about how these historical events have changed the context of policy in the 21st century, and then identify and address two specific outstanding issues on the agendas of the countries concerned. I think in many ways the Russo-Japanese War was the first concrete step in the beginning of the end of a Eurocentric world. Because I think an historian 1,000 years from now, asked to summarize the 20th century in a sentence, would say that at the beginning of the century, the world was structured around a dozen European-centered imperial systems. And by the end of the century, all of those imperial systems were gone. And the locus of world power and dynamism had shifted to North America, East Asia, and to a lesser extent to Southwest Asia. I think in many respects, the conflict that took place over a relatively short period in the Far East 100 years ago also marked the beginning of the European imperial retreat from Asia and the beginning of the restoration of East Asia to the status in the global economy and in global politics which it had had before the period of European imperialism. In that regard, I think that some of the events of that war are natural precursors to better known events that came later, that the fall of Port Arthur, Battle of Mukden, and Tsushima were natural precursors to the fall of Singapore, the sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse, and to Dien Bien Phu. Now, the Japanese role in this is perhaps the one that is best known and understood. The first Asian country that embraced modernity as its response to the challenge of European imperialism. The first one that was able to meet the imperial powers on their own status and to win. And it did so most dramatically in this first conflict of the 20th century. Today, of course, Japan has found that its model has been so successful that it has been copied by almost every other country in East Asia. When I was a university student, there was still a lot of talk about the uniqueness of the Japanese model. Today, when one looks at the Asian economies, what we see is how numerous are the cases of different means of adapting Asian societies to modernity and how successful this has generally been. So that today Japan finds herself challenged not by European powers, but by other Asian countries in economics and ultimately, of course, in other issues. So that 100 years ago, most of the world's ships were built in Britain. 30 years ago, most of the world's ships were built in Japan. Today, the majority of the world's ships are built in South Korea, and the South Korean shipbuilders are very worried that 20 years from now, they may be out of the shipbuilding business because it will have moved to China. The speed of some of these changes is really quite dramatic. In the early and mid-1990s, much Japanese external investment was focused in Southeast Asia, in places like Thailand and Malaysia, where it created whole new industries. Having recently been in that part of Asia, you can see now how much of an economic depression there is because how quickly much of that investment has been refocused to China. Now, I'm a person who doesn't believe that it's all onwards and upwards for China, because they have more than their fair share of problems to deal with, particularly of being the first country to get very old very quickly before it got rich. The huge discrepancies between rural and urban China, between the old industrial sector and the new industries, and the huge demographic problems created by the one-child policy. So I understand that the Chinese government is seeking to get rich as quickly as it can because it has a lot of bills to pay. Nonetheless, the restoration of China to a place, perhaps not of primacy, but to a leading role in the Asian power system, changes things for everyone, and of course, very much so for Japan. The Russian position, I think, is in some ways historically not so well understood. Russia was one of a number of European countries that got involved in East Asia and in the battle to cut up China in much the same way that was done in Africa. The Russian case was unique in that it was an overland as well as an overseas engagement. I think it's not so well understood how important was the overseas element of it, in part because of the distances across the continent, because the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 made it practical, whereas the railway links were not completed until much, much later. And it was this overseas aspect of the Russian presence in the Far East that made the Russo-Japanese War so much a naval war rather than merely a land war. Now, for the Russians today, there is a great deal of concern as to how tenuous, how fragile, and how permanent, perhaps, will Russia's position in the Far East be. There's a lot of literature about this, about concentrating on demographics, on economic weaknesses, on the simple expense to a country, 90% of whose population live in Europe, in maintaining a position almost halfway around the world. I think it's fair to say that Russian attitudes toward Japan are that Japanese economic engagement with the Russian Far East is essential to maintaining Russia in Asia. That without an active economic interchange between the Russian Far East and Japan and South Korea, that the long-term Russian position in that part of the world may not be tenable. So the focus of Russian concerns is not Japan, it is, of course, China. And the understanding of what anyone who's visited the Military History Museum in Beijing knows, that much of the Russian Far East is comprised of territories that were ceded by the Manchus under two of what are called the unequal treaties, those of 1858 and 1860, which are what are now Primorsky and Khabarovsky Krais. While this is not on anyone's near-term agenda in Beijing, you don't have to talk to too many people in too many policy institutes in China to understand that they are on their long-term agendas. Now, for the United States, in some ways, we became an Asian power also because of a combination of overland and overseas expansion, but in a different way. The United States became an Asian power, but we are not and never will be an Asian country. And in an odd way, the United States engages in Asia very differently than we ever have with Europe, because there's not an integrated alliance system as there was in NATO. There's sort of a hub and spoke system in which the United States has separate alliance arrangements with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, and various other countries, which come from different historical periods. And the only thing that really unites them is the role of the United States. In many ways, it is the fact that the United States is the world's premier sea power that defines much of its relationship in this part of the world, because the geography of East Asia inevitably is one that is focused on naval power and on maritime trade. Though we're in the odd situation that the United States has the world's dominant navy, and the United States has, for practical purposes, no merchant marine. that almost all the trade between Asia and North America is carried in somebody else's ships. And it's also true that the focus of American interest in Asia from the early part of the 19th century until today has always been on China. The casus belli for the United States in the Second World War, as I try always to explain to Europeans, was the future of China. The United States has had a very up and down relationship over generations with China. Sometimes we idealize them, sometimes we demonize them. But as someone who grew up in a small town in the American Midwest, I remember very well that in the 1950s, the key focus of what people thought about in the outside world was China. Some of that is the legacy of the missionaries, some of that is the legacy of the Second World War, but for whatever reason, China looms large in the American mind in the way that I think no other country in the world does, or is likely to in the future. Now, the first issue I'd like to identify is the one which was, of course, at the focus of the war 100 years ago, which is the future of Korea. Now, Japan, Russia, America, and China all have conflicted and difficult histories of involvement in Korea. But in a key way, the role of the United States is different. We're not an Asian country. Our concerns about North Korea have to do with its impact on other parts of the world, principally through proliferation issues. If things go very badly wrong in North Korea, we can walk away. China, Russia, and Japan obviously cannot. Their concerns are for their own neighborhood. Japan's concern defined in part by the missiles that were fired over the middle of Honshu. In Russia and Vladivostok, they've had exercises to practice what would happen if there was a huge nuclear catastrophe in North Korea and the radioactivity followed the wind to the east. In China, they're very concerned with refugee flows out of North Korea. So in many ways, the regional countries, I think, have equities. They have stakes that are greatly different and larger than those of the United States, and require people in that region to think about the future of Korea in many ways more seriously than Washington is likely to do. And the probability that North Korea is approaching a systemic crisis of the kind that required the world to authorize interventions in places like Albania, Sierra Leone, Haiti, Central Africa, Afghanistan, Liberia. No one, obviously, would welcome the task of intervening in North Korea. But I can imagine circumstances in which the alternatives would be much worse. I cannot imagine circumstances in which I think this would be a task well performed by the United States. One, we don't have the resources. The resources we do have are principally bombardment, which would not be appropriate. And I cannot imagine that the people of North Korea would welcome an American intervention. For obvious historic reasons, Japan's role would have to be largely economic. I certainly can imagine a circumstance in which China and Russia jointly may feel the necessity of protecting their own regional interests by doing something about a collapse of social order in North Korea. And I think other countries in the region and the world should understand that that may become a necessity and that the alternatives might be much worse. The recent Chinese-Russian military exercises were conducted in a way, as a number of commentators in Moscow have pointed out, to send a message to people in Pyongyang that such a thing is at least within the capability of these governments. The other issue, which I will touch on very briefly because it was raised earlier today, is the territorial dispute between Russia and Japan. I have no answers to this. I have been an observer to a number of territorial disputes, ranging from Cyprus and the Falklands to Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, Transnistria, and even Gibraltar. There's no such thing as an easy territorial dispute. But the dispute between Japan and Russia, it seems to me, is a little unusual in the extent to which the two sides at a political level talk past each other. You could say that at least they don't yell at each other. But in many ways, and I am not talking about specialists, I'm not talking about diplomats, I'm struck at how much the political elites in the two countries imagine that for the other country, the issue is artificial. I have heard this from Russian politicians many times, the belief that the Japanese government is keeping this issue alive as a provocation, that it's not a real issue for Japan, whereas of course it is. I've heard a parallel view a number of times from Japanese equivalents, that the Russian government could deal with this issue easily by just signing a piece of paper, which is also not true. And if there's any single lesson I have learned about territorial disputes over the decades, is that economics never solves them. The expectation that the benefits of trade, the benefits of economic union will somehow create a situation that will overcome the historical or political difficulties simply never works. These disputes are never about money. Economics is always a key element of a solution, but economics alone will never create the basis for a solution. And if there's anything I think that is needed on the territorial dispute, it's for members of the two legislatures, members of the two political elites, to communicate with each other, to travel back and forth with each other, and at least come to understand that for the other side, this is a serious issue. And that's at least a beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting comments, which are very familiar to me in New York. Now, let me explain my plan. My plan is that to give 5 minutes each before the conclusion of the session to the two presenters. That means we have to get a discussion, get a comments from as many people as possible here up until 2:45. So in order to get as many comments as possible, would you make your comments as brief as possible? And then if you find, hopefully, I hope, I think the time limitation might be 3 minutes for each. And if you find a very keen interest to make a follow-up to the previous speaker, then please give me a sign that you need a very quick intervention. So, okay, first of all.
Apropos of the last discussion, what were the motivations that led to the rather rapid, in fact, a sudden settlement of the dispute over the islands in the Amur River between China and Russia? And are there any lessons from that that might be useful?
So these questions should be answered at the final stage, so I can get many other comments. Yes?
I was struck by the way that the two Americans on the panel brought us a lot of pessimism, scary predictions, while Vladimir Ivanov from Russia, that part of the world, told us a more hopeful story, was more optimistic, gave us more hopeful predictions. And I'd like to hear him respond to the pessimism in the American presentations.
Anyone else? Hide-sensei?
I think the paper has been very useful, and they do serve to bring some of the themes of the conference together. I was particularly thinking about Professor Yokote's presentation this morning. I think what these two papers do is to establish some kind of connection between the current situation or the immediate future possibilities and the Russo-Japanese War. And I think this is what the conference has been trying to do. If I read Yokote's paper in an appropriate way, and if I read these two papers, I think what they're suggesting is that there has been some kind of a continuing theme in Russian-Japanese relations since 1905. That is, I think Yokote would begin to would see, or at least would suggest that we see the emergence of something like a regional order, a regional structure of East Asia from the end of the Russo-Japanese War. And by that, I think what Yokote means, and these two papers have meant, primarily 4 countries, Japan, China, Russia, and United States, how they somehow negotiated their regional arrangements, or failed to negotiate their regional arrangements. But at least there is the consciousness of the fact that in 1905, something is developing there. And whatever that something is going to develop successfully or not depends to a great extent on the ability of these 4 to live with each other, to arrange their affairs amicably and so on. And I think what Professor Yokote was emphasizing was that Russia and Japan somehow managed to do that. US and China managed to do that. We've heard much about that. I think that the United States supported China throughout the first half of the 20th century, Chinese modernization, Chinese integrity, and so on, which Russia and Japan did not. But they are aware of the fact that there is something quite regional. And therefore, my question, not so much a question as a comment, would be to say that whether any kind of a stable regional system is going to develop in the 21st century would still, I think, would go back to the first question, whether these 4 would be able to manage their affairs, manage their regional affairs amicably, without some kind of a system to come to terms with China, which would mean also coming to terms with US-Chinese relations. Russia and Japan alone cannot solve any of the regional issues. It seems to me that everything has to be put in this regional context, and that it may be the way to solve the territorial dispute and other questions as well. I think it's a very good thing that instead of simply viewing these things in bilateral terms or binational terms, if we can see them in some regional framework, that would be a very encouraging development. And I don't know if Mr. Yokote would agree with that or not, but he does seem to take this back to 1905 as the beginning when this question began to be raised. But if we say the US has to be part of it, in a sense we're saying that we're not talking about East Asian regional order. Everybody's talking about that in today's world. Everybody in China is talking about that. Everybody in Japan is talking about the emerging East Asian economic order. That's not what we seem to be talking about. We seem to be talking about probably a North Pacific regional community in which we talk about the United States and Russia, China, Japan, probably Korea, and so on. I mean, it's a different kind of regional system. But if that develops, some kind of North Pacific regional community or Northeast Asia plus Pacific regional community, we could well go back to Russo-Japanese War saying that that was where it began to develop. I think David Wolf said that the countries go up and go down. I agree. I would also say that nations change too, that United States, Japan, China, Russia today are not what they were 100 years ago. I think they are thinking more and more regionally. To that extent, I think the nature of their national identities has changed too. And I might add, regions also go up and go down. And I think the European region has come up, has not gone down yet. The Northeast Asian region is about to go up, has not made its appearance quite clearly yet, but I think this is what it's going to happen probably. Thank you.
Yokoto Sensei, you need to make any quick response? No? Okay. Okay. Yukiba-san?
I want to ask David. I enjoyed your remarks on anti-Americanism in Northeast Asia. But one thing I felt is that it seemed to me that you understood that about Japanese anti-Americanism, you took it rather direct reaction against the treaty, Portsmouth Treaty. But I think it should be understood in a rather broader context, historical context, especially after the Sino-Japanese War, because after that war, the process of dividing China commenced, and it strengthened the distrust towards Western powers, or what Western powers called civilization or justice in Japanese public opinions. Of course, Japan was ambivalent because she wanted to join that contest, but in the meantime, Japan felt some stronger, deeper distrust. And that distrust could be applied to the United States because the president was Theodore Roosevelt, and he deployed some kind of power politics while proclaiming open door policy. Some Japanese felt that it's kind of hypocrisy, and they made some critical articles even before the Japanese-Russo War. Of course, Portsmouth Treaty is an important impetus, but I think you can argue that in a more broader chronological context. Thank you.
Let me, on an individual capacity, I'd like to make some short follow-up to what Professor Yokiba said about his question on anti-Americanism. I was rather curious when I read the paper, though I was impressed by many points made by David. But anti-American feeling was there in Japan, but not because of the Portsmouth Treaty. But within a few years from that time, more in the context of the immigration issue and also over the conflict on the Manchurian interest, or American interest, American initiative into Manchuria, and then which was shared. The concern was shared also by Russia. That's a major reason to unite the Russia and Japan. And then also, though you say something about anti-Americanism on the part of China, but China came to more pro-American eventually, and sending many students to the United States. And as Michael Hunt pointed out, that Chinese interest in frontier defense and American interest in open door united those two countries. And also on Korea, okay, there was some disappointment possibly, but still the Korean people try to rely on the United States continuously. So the relationship between those countries, Japan, Russia, China, Korea, vis-a-vis United States, was mainly decided by the interests, national interests, geopolitically defined. That's my point. But anyhow, if you have any counter-argument, I'd like to hear later on.
Everyone seems to be on this point right now. It might be good to respond.
Oh, okay.
I'll be quite brief about it. I see that I have a comment, well, from all three of you, from Professor Irie, from Professor Yokibe, and from Professor Kitaoka, all commenting on this. And I want to sort of, because it was a little rushed in presentation, I want to say what it is that I'm doing by presenting this vision of Northeast Asian anti-Americanism. I'm not saying that this is how it was, that everyone was deeply anti-American and has been ever since. What I'm saying, because we all know the history, I'm saying something much more similar to what Yokote Sensei did this morning, where he said there's two sides to this. There's constructive things that come out of it, and there's conflicted things that come out of it. And I'm saying, okay, now let's look at anti-Americanism in the world today, because I think we can all recognize that there's a stream of anti-Americanism in the world today almost everywhere that hasn't been there in the past. And imagine doing what I refer to as constructed history. In my paper, I talk about two ways of doing histories, and a constructed history that works from the present going backwards and looks for the antecedents of today. If you were doing it as Northeast Asia region, building from some kind of present anti-Americanism, which one can imagine circumstances in the course of 10 years, say, that could produce a consensus of anti-Americanism in the region, then they would look at this moment. On the other hand, I consider it just as possible, the way Professor Irie presents it, that in fact we'll see a positive development in the region, and we'll go back to this moment and say this was the birth of something positive and regional. But I'm pointing out both possibilities, that this is an open-ended thing, but it's an open-ended past, depending on our open-ended future. Thank you.
Thank you. I have two questions. One question to Professor Wolf and one question to Mr. Ivanov. My question to Professor Wolf is probably in conjunction with what you have just been saying, the question of emerging nature of the regional, contemporary regionalism in Asia. I think in your closing statement, you have juxtaposed two regionalisms. One is Northeast Asian, and another one Asian Pacific. However, in your paper, in the concluding part of in your paper, it is written that in order to prevent isolation, the United States must continue to promote the vision of Asian Pacific rather than the more exclusive Northeast Asia. In my understanding, now there are three visions of regionalism in Asia. One is, as you mentioned, Asia Pacific. This is based on APEC and ARF. It's certainly inclusive. No one is rejected. But at this juncture, the product, the agreement are fairly moderate in both APEC and ARF. But there's now second regionalism, which is East Asian regionalism, based on ASEAN +3. And this is now evolving to the East Asian community. Here, there is a question of exclusivity, particularly in relation to the United States. So I understand very well that if you or the American scholars argue that there's a problem about East Asian regionalism because there's a question of inclusivity and exclusivity, particularly in relation to the United States. Now, but for Northeastern regionalism, we are basically talking about this regionalism of United States, China, Russia, Japan, and Korea. And in terms of the countries pertaining to this region, it's full. I mean, everyone is there. And the issue which we have been discussing is the question of denuclearization of North Korea, which is a real issue. And as you have pointed out, the now emerging six-party talks and possibly kind of divergent from their five-party talks might have a real basis for regionalism in Northeast Asia, which I do not think have a character of exclusivity. So my question is, what is your preference, or why is your preference of the Asian Pacific vis-a-vis Northeast Asia regionalism? Have I made myself clear? Yes. Okay. The second question is to Mr. Ivanov. In your presentation, you said you are prepared to explain further the question of the pipeline issue and the oil issue in East Asia. And I will be very grateful if you can follow it up, because in the difficulty of contemporary Japan-Russian relations, particularly in the last few years, the pipeline issue and the energy issue has been one of the most interesting and very strategic issue. And to my understanding, things has been looked very interesting up until the end of last year. But as it is developing this year, at least from Japanese perspective, things are becoming a bit difficult. But in your paper, you are hinting that maybe this is not the case. In that case, I'll be really interested to hear. Why why this is promising, not only for Russia and China, but also for Japan. Thank you.
A question and a suggestion. Is it not true that the problem that we are dealing with in terms of coalitions is different from what it was over the last century when China was weak and what it is now when China is becoming strong? I mean, doesn't that change most of the givens? I mean, we're talking about extrapolating from a situation of Russia, Japan, and the United States dealing with a declining China or a weak China, extrapolating that into a situation where they need to deal with a China that is becoming stronger. And it seems to me that those are different situations. It makes it very difficult to extrapolate from a Portsmouth situation out into the 21st century. In that connection, as a former diplomat dealing with South Asia, and someone who follows South Asia, it seems to me that it may no longer be possible to deal with South Asia, to deal with Asia by excluding South Asia. It may no longer be possible to treat the problems of South Asia as if it was a self-contained world which had nothing to do with Northeast Asia. South Asia is also changing. The two main countries are both nuclear. India is getting 7 and 8% a year growth and is liberalizing its economy. And in this situation, it seems to me the United States will always be tempted to call in India to counterbalance this growing China, and that too will change the whole diplomatic landscape. And it seems to me that we're moving in that direction now. I personally think it's sort of sorcerer's apprenticeship, but if we move in the direction of an alliance with India, which is the direction we're moving, in order to counterbalance China, most of the things that we have been talking about around this table take on a different aspect. And you get into different configurations and a different landscape. It seems to me not possible to limit the field either to Northeast Asia, except perhaps for the specific problem of denuclearizing Korea, or to the Asia-Pacific region as such without including South Asia now. Thank you.
Just 1 minute information from me. When I joined the discussion group under Prime Minister Miyazawa in 1992, when the topic was the Japan and the Asia Pacific in the 21st century, we first discussed what kind of area we should discuss, and then we tried to avoid Russia and India at that time. But when I joined in a similar kind of group under Prime Minister Obuchi in 1998, it was very natural to discuss India and Russia. So the concept of region is changing, and I think it's expanding. Except for the South Asia, of course, there's existence and rising of Southeast Asia. So this should be also included in our discussion, I think. Thank you. Yes.
I just wanted to follow up on Ambassador Togo's question to Mr. Ivanov. Assuming that you're correct and something positive yet develops, in the energy sector, despite what my good friend Wayne said about the not very, encouraging implications from economics in terms of resolution of issues like the territorial question, the Northern Territories, would you speculate, how, if the energy trade does develop very significantly, how that could impact on some type of a solution?
I just wanted to respond to something that Mr. Mary said about regional countries have equities in North Korea and the nuclear issue that force a more serious consideration of the DPRK than the U.S. At the risk of sounding like an administration apologist, and I don't want to come across as that, so let's just call me a devil's advocate with no statement on who the devil is. But it's serious in what sense? I mean, what perspective are we looking at here, long-term or short-term? It's clear that the regional powers, especially Russia and Russia and China, and increasingly the South Koreans as well, are more worried about the possibility of a conflict on the peninsula, that is to say, the United States going in with guns blazing. I'm still under the coverage of that disclosure or disclaimer I said earlier, by the way. So they're more worried about the U.S. going in with guns blazing than they are about the fate of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The United States is clearly focused on the future of the NPT. And I think it's important to see that there could be a trade-off here, that the United States has kept the option of force on the table and has looked for support to the regional powers in order to lean on the DPRK to abandon its nuclear weapons program. Can we really say that the tension that this approach has created is more dangerous than the collapse of the NPT itself? The regional argument, particularly the Chinese and the Russian argument 2 years ago on this issue, had been prefaced on the position of doubt that the DPRK had either the ability or the intent to construct a nuclear weapon. These opinions are changing very rapidly. The Chinese and the Russians are starting to come to terms not only with the ability and the intent of the North Koreans to do this, but also with the possibility that they are pursuing the uranium enrichment that this whole thing began over. Though these opinions are changing, the position of protecting short-term stability over the fate of the NPT is not. And so I'm wondering how this is taking the issue more seriously than the U.S. approach.
Thank you. Any more? No comment? Yes.
American concern for maintaining the NPT becomes even more important in view of the fact of what we're also doing with India. This is a follow-up to my previous comment, which is creating a hole in the NPT, which we want to mobilize our allies to open so that India can walk through it. Thank you.
So then we'll go to the round for the presenters, and then if we have still some time, then we'll go to take another question. So, David, you go first? So then, me?
Thank you very much. I think I will try to address some of the questions and comments. First is as far as I can understand, my understanding of the sources of the American pessimism with regard to Northeast Asia. I think the discussant put it very eloquently, saying that the United States could walk away. I think this explains a lot. The other issue is that the United States probably will not be able to walk away politically and economically, but physically the United States could walk away. Russia, China, and South Korea, as well as Japan, cannot afford that kind of stance. And if we look at the prehistory of the last round of the six-party talks, we could clearly see the differences. The United States stood alone on the kind of very tough attitudes with regard to North Korea. South Korea perhaps was the most liberal and open-minded and willing to pursue some constructive routes of engagement with North Korea. Of course, China and Russia are not very happy at all, as far as I can understand what North Korea is doing, but also what North Korea is saying, because it is still a question whether North Korea truly has a nuclear weapon. But since the leader and the spokespersons of the government say that there is a nuclear weapon, Russia and China has no other option but to accept this as a kind of true reality. Japan, of course, isn't between United States and these three countries because of primarily the issues of the abductees. This is a very emotional issue, and I think this situation and this position must be understood properly. But as far as I can understand, there are some kind of discussions, informal discussions underway in Japan, and a lot of interest towards North Korea as far as the economic reforms are concerned. In fact, North Korea is undergoing economic reforms, and my colleagues who are traveling from Japan to North Korea, they bring new evidence, new information each time they go there. Why I believe we should be rather optimistic on the future of Northeast Asia? Because of at least 2 or 3 reasons. First, the economic interdependence. China has become the #1 trading partner for Japan, South Korea, and will soon become leading trading partner for Russia. And we are talking about big figures. Hundreds of billions of dollars in trade are involved. And if we look at the Sakhalin, which has more impact on relationship with Japan, the cost of the 2 Sakhalin projects is going to be close to $40 billion US. And at this moment, as we speak, Japan has contracted already half of the output of the Sakhalin liquefied natural gas plant, the first phase. The 2 phases will produce natural gas to the scale that China, half of the current consumption of China. So Japan is likely to be the major consumer of natural gas from Sakhalin being transported in the form of LNG. And this is clearly the very significant, very sturdy pillar of interdependence. Nobody would like to risk neither commercial nor security or simply the energy supply stability grounds on that. And as far as the regional structures are concerned, Professor Erie was indicating at these issues. I think that there are some moments, there are some conceptual moments on the part of Japan and South Korea as well as China. In fact, both Japan and South Korea expressed their conceptual outlines towards regional economic cooperation. They mostly speak about East Asia, East Asian economic community. But South Korea, as we all know, for the last few years is pursuing actively the concept of the South Korea as the economic hub on Northeast Asia. I believe that maybe it is a little bit a narrow approach, but the willingness to pursue regional institution building is there. And I think in comparison with Europe, or maybe ASEAN, Northeast Asia has an opportunity to promote functional cooperation as a first phase, meaning that energy, environment, transportation, certain standards in customs regulations and visa regulations, and there are many areas which they can borrow from the APEC, because APEC already provided lots of material for that kind of experiments on the sub-regional basis, and I think this is entirely possible. On the other hand, it's always easier to conceptualize about regional cooperation than implement regional cooperation. Look at the position of Japanese government. Japanese government is fully in support of the ASEAN +3. Both Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry as well as Ministry of Foreign Affairs came up recently with the kind of concepts of regional economic and energy cooperation. But when it comes to the Pacific Pipeline, the position changed. The position changed to the extent that the stumbling block, in fact, in negotiations was that the Japanese government is willing to promote this project and to help the way it can, but the condition of this help is to channel all the oil to the Pacific coast, not to China. which, because of obvious reasons, Russia cannot accept. China is the major trading partner, is the neighbor, and this is a kind of unfortunate dilemma currently on the table between Moscow and Tokyo. I hope it will be resolved somehow. I think the irony is even if the entire flow of oil will be directed to the Pacific, half of this oil will be consumed by the Chinese. And everybody knows that. Chinese experts and Japanese experts, as well as potential shippers of oil in Russia. So it is kind of more symbolic political issue rather than true economic issue. And then energy trade. I think energy trade will be, it is going to be the major pillar of economic integration in Northeast Asia. I think energy trade would extend to South Asia as well, because India, as we know, is a partner of the Sakhalin-1 project and will become a partner perhaps in other projects as well. And I think the idea of looking broader at the future of the Asia, of the Asian region, including Northeast Asia, I think is a very promising and maybe there is no other way but to do that. And in fact, in Vladivostok, there was a meeting recently between the foreign ministers of Japan, China, and India. I wouldn't rule out that on the sidelines of the G8 meeting in St. Petersburg next year, Mr. Putin would hold a summit meeting with the leaders of China and India. And that probably would be an interesting event to see. And finally, I think Pacific Pipeline. The difference is that Pacific Pipeline project is very much on the desk of Mr. Putin himself. He thinks about this project as a strategic, most important project in his agenda for developing Eastern Siberia and the Far Eastern region, as well as promoting export of energy resources to the neighboring countries. I'm afraid that this issue was not taken that seriously in Japan. I think there was some kind of mismatch in perceptions. And this is understandable. Japan is not that desperate in terms of regional development, in terms of export incomes, in terms of jobs. But this is my understanding that Mr. Putin takes care of this project by himself. And this creates a lot of turbulences when things are delayed, as they always delayed when bureaucracies deal with these issues, or there are no concrete answers to very concrete, specific questions. So that's perhaps what is happening. Thank you.
Then David, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I do have a couple of questions here, but they're not really enough to eat up 5 minutes. So I'm going to trade hats with the commentator and comment on the commentator's comments, even if they weren't really comments on what I said in the first place. Mr. Mary's points, especially his issues, are crucial issues. They're the central issues. They're the key stumbling blocks. They're certainly the major downside that we need to try to avoid. Concerns about there being some kind of implosion in Korea and not continuing to not make headway on the territorial issue. Let me start with the territorial issue. There was someone who asked a question about the Amur River also that deserves a brief answer. Clearly, if we're thinking in terms of a long-term solution, and a long-term solution will certainly be the smoother solution, we need to slowly mobilize constituencies in both countries to support this. I've read those working group meetings that happened before the Gorbachev meeting. They were leaked on the Russian side, and they're just ridiculous, the kinds of discussions that take place between the Russian and the Japanese side, totally talking past each other, absolutely not willing to listen to each other. And if anything, the Russians in that perestroika moment. We're saying, listen, we want to do something here, and you keep saying the same thing you've been saying to us for 20 years, and the Japanese just said, we'd like to say this one more time. And they just did it over and over again, and I actually published it on the web a few years ago, but you know, it's up there if anyone wants to read it at the website of the Cold War International History Project. I don't necessarily think that the territorial issue has to go the slow road. I really think a quick solution is possible. I'm looking specifically at the Amur case. In the case of the final solution that was reached, you know, we're all told that the Chinese eventually will come back with irredenta on it, but for the moment, they've buried the hatchet. It was a decision that was made pretty much at the highest level. Ishaev in Khabarovsky Krai didn't know until like the day before it was going to be signed that it was going to be signed. People can tell me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding, is that Putin made this decision and he didn't consult with anyone at the regional level. He just did it. Something very similar happened when they resolved their border dispute with Kazakhstan. When was that? In like January, I think it was? Where, you know, just one fine day, everybody in the Kremlin took a trip down to Kazakhstan, and they met with all the top guys, which are like Nazarbayev and his family, and they buried the hatchet, and that was that. And, you know, and no doubt there's someone who's got complaints about it. On the other hand, it was done. And I don't see any reason why Putin couldn't do the exact same thing. It's much harder on the Japanese side, of course, except we're probably poised tomorrow to see a smashing victory for Koizumi. Probably. You know, I'm no great pundit on Japanese politics, but from everything I've seen, he's looking pretty good. He's looking pretty good. And he's a guy who really likes to pull surprises, not only on his party and not only on his probably on the public, but he loves to pull surprises on his foreign ministry as well. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if he reached agreement with Putin and they basically had a plan that he thought he could sell to the Japanese public, and they never even told the Gaimusho about it until very late in the game. Now, you know, obviously no diplomat likes to hear that stuff, but my sense of the way Koizumi plays is that that's a possibility. You know, it's a small possibility. But I'm saying it's in the realm of the possible, considering who the actors are at the moment. And, of course, if Koizumi loses or it's tight, then all bets are off. So you heard it here first. If it happens, forget it if it doesn't happen. The future of Korea. This goes back to the whole question of Ambassador Togo's question about what region do you want to talk about here. The answer is that, you know, you can talk about any region you want. Region is just made up. You know, it's totally constructed. There's no such thing as natural regions. It's whatever you do it. Every discipline draws its region differently. If you want to do the economic linkages, it looks different from the demographic linkages, from the military linkages. You know, it's basically how you pick it. For dealing with the North Korean and the Korean problem as a whole, because I don't think it's just a North Korean problem, it's a Korea issue. To deal with that, I think the right scale is Northeast Asia. I think Asia, you know, it's Northeast Asia, but with the Americans in, let's say. So that's what I'm saying when I say Asia Pacific. I don't really mean the whole Pacific Rim. And, you know, I'm really sort of talking about Northeast Asia plus the United States. Now, why do I think that's the right scale? I think it's the right scale because it's the footprint of the Korean diaspora. They have roughly 1 million Koreans in every single country, well, more in China, but you have China, you have Russia, you have the United States, and you have Japan. And there's 1 million Koreans in each place. And I think that that could be a powerful galvanizing mechanism for reaching acceptance for whatever deal you come up with in the end, if you come up with some kind of a deal. And I think that that could be, you know, you have like 1 million ambassadors for Korea in every country if they feel that it's a successful solution and it's something that they want to believe in and that they want to convince all of their neighbors about. Now, I know that that doesn't sound like an argument about any country's interests to talk about a million immigrants into a country somewhere. And I know that most of these decisions are reached based on interests. Now, this is part of the difference between the way that diplomats approach their material and historians approach their material. Historians, we love to sit with the diplomats and we love to try to say something policy relevant, and I'd love to help you solve, all your major diplomatic problems. I'd like to see these problems go away. On the other hand, aside from occasionally doing sort of tight, rational, geopolitical type thinking that mainly is what diplomats are trained to do, and military personnel, historians also tell stories, and they also listen to people's stories. And in this region of Northeast Asia, I'm hearing people tell a lot of stories based on their histories, and they're stories that they're not going to be at peace with unless people relate to their emotions as well as their interests. And I certainly heard this on my last trip to China, where I talked with people pretty high up the party ladder, and they said to me, how can the Japanese not understand that the leadership generation in China is made up of people whose families were raped or killed or had horrible things done to them during World War II? Can't they just look at the age structure? And no one's going to say it in China because not everyone in the leadership has that kind of a family story. So it's considered sort of bad form to sort of say my family has it because your family doesn't. But still, we're talking about something like 60 or 70% of the top leadership of the Chinese policy has a terrible story about World War II in their family, and they're not going to let it go. They're just not going to let it go, and they're only going to take something, not a well-worded apology. They want something with feeling. And it occurs to me that in looking back at the history of this region, I'm almost there, and looking back at the history of the region and the traditions of this region, it shouldn't be all that hard for people to realize that they can show some respect for each other's dead family. Everybody's dead family. This is supposed to be a region that has great respect for family. And maybe they can show respect for other people's families as well as their own. And maybe then they can bury the hatchet. Maybe they need to look back a little bit in order to be able to move forward. Thank you.
Okay. Right. Two questions were addressed at me. One on the Amur River settlement. I think it reflects the fact that both governments were in the process of solving border issues with a number of their neighbors. And both governments had reached a point where they were prepared to settle this issue. In a situation like that, diplomats can get a deal done. That's what diplomats are paid for. That's very different than giving up inhabited territory that is specified in the Constitution as being part of the national territory. And in Moscow, the Kuril Islands are often seen as analogous to Kaliningrad. You give up one to Japan, you give the other back to Germany. And it's related to the question, how do you hold on to Chechnya if you've begun the process of unraveling the Federation? Not all of these arguments are persuasive to me, but all of these arguments have to be dealt with. On Korea, I wasn't first talking about the collapse of the NPT. I was talking about the potential collapse of the DPRK. And I think it is a fact that there are many people in Washington, not all, but many, who would regard the collapse of North Korea as positive, as a solution. I find it difficult to believe that many responsible people in Seoul, Tokyo, Beijing, or Moscow would think that way. It's a different set of equities. And if I had to enumerate the governments that I would hold responsible for what's left of the carcass of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I would have to name my own, and over a series of administrations. If there's not much left of the NPT, I think we have the nuclear weapon states and the first nuclear weapon state have a good deal to answer for.
Thank you. It's just 3 o'clock, so I'd like to adjourn this meeting, and I'd like to have some information from Stephen.
Yeah. So there will be viewing of the Orozco murals in the lower level of the library, I guess starting right now, Ken, at 3 o'clock. And there are also refreshments outside. And how about if we reconvene at 3:30 for the wrap-up session? So 3:30, come back here. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Can we get started? Shall we begin now? I think we'll plan to finish at 4:15 or close to that point. We're going to lose our interpreters at that time, so that might be a good concluding point at 4:15. If you see on your schedule, there will be cocktails from 5 o'clock in the Wheelock room. This is in the hotel where we had the dinner Thursday night. And the dinner begins at 5:30, I think goes till 6:45, I believe. And there'll be time for you then to move to Moore Hall, where tonight's events will take place, back in that auditorium we were in Thursday night with John Dower's talk. All right, well, this is an opportunity for sort of open discussion, comments that you might have. This afternoon and then this evening we're getting more into sort of contemporary issues. And one of the big questions is, where do we go from here? If I could just let you know where we're going here at Dartmouth, on a sort of parochial note. In the next 2 months, Alan and I will be putting together a summary report of this conference that probably will come out as an occasional paper of the Dickey Center, I think is sort of the plan at the moment. And then we also plan to put together an edited volume of the papers of this conference. That'll be probably over the next 6 months, maybe, if we can do that. And then another thing we have in mind is to have a smaller working group that will meet probably next spring, perhaps again in the fall, to do some follow-up studies, and if this doesn't sound too presumptuous, to come up with some policy recommendations. So we'll be doing that as well, putting together such a group. And we would actually welcome any suggestions you might have as to how we might proceed with these plans, particularly this idea of a working group. And I welcome any comments you might have, any reactions to what the wonderful discussions we've had so far. So I will open the floor. If anybody would like to make a comment.
I didn't have enough chance to speak in the former session. So, the one thing which is missing from the discussion in the former session was the problem of the political system, or domestic political system, and the political value of those kind of things. We cannot we cannot make the comparison between the Russo-Japanese War and the Pacific War without comparing domestic political situation, because foreign policies are, by and large, the expression or output of the domestic political system. This is also important to look at the value. We cannot explain the Russian policy toward the Far East without analyzing political system in Tsari system. This leads us to the question on today. As was pointed out by Vladimir, the more important role is now being played by the private sector in Japan-Russia economic relations, of course, and this is a very welcome development. But it has become possible because of the democratization or the change of political system. Because in an authoritarian or a totalitarian regime, economic issues can be handled or utilized politically. So without a change of political system, we cannot promote more and more private exchange of the people and goods and money, so forth. So the problem goes to the China. Then can we discuss the situation in East Asia without analyzing the changing or unchanging political system in China? That's a big issue we have to take care of. Also about Russia. Russia has been somewhat democratized, but not enough. In United Nations, I see some kind of setback or some movement toward the opposite direction. We can just remember the Russian effort to intervene to the neighboring countries in Ukraine, and also to the Central Asian countries, like and also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is playing one role, and then also the joint exercise which was pointed out by Russia and China, and also in the Security Council discussion in the past 2-3 months, Russian position has become very, very tough on these humanitarian issue or democratization issue. So my suggestion, or if anyone has a very good answer, I don't know. But my suggestion is that we have to include this dimension of political system, political value in our discussion on regionalism or regional cooperation. One more thing, if I may add, is that can we really make a regionalism or regional organization with superpower in it? For example, the North American or American organization, regional organization with America, is it a real organization? Or South Asian organization? Of course, there is a SARC, something called SARC, but this is one big giant, India, and other countries. So by definition, I wonder if it is difficult to create a regional organization with one superpower in it. And of course, there are some other difficulties on the part of the Eastern Asia because of differences of the political system, religion, economic power, economic size, so forth. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that the regionalism is impossible in Asia, but we have to be careful about those kinds of differences, and particularly with or without superpower. Thank you.
At the risk of just being a simple country lawyer in a group of august academics, I'd like to at least state one part of the process, or at least the history of the process that has not been stated, I think, so far today or yesterday. And that is, as a matter of diplomatic history, as a matter of the actual actions of interlocutors in a time of war. What happened here 100 years ago was quite unique, irrespective of what its ultimate effects may have been on the region. In this sense, the President of the United States, who was then not the head of the world's most powerful country militarily, offered his good offices to two warring nations in the largest war ever fought up until that time between two nations. The process that he used in order to create the ability of the two parties to resolve the differences on their own terms, the way he used the United States Navy as the actual formal people who hosted the process, the way he used the government of New Hampshire and the local people to foster the process, much as the ambassador has just indicated businessmen may be a way of fostering a diplomatic process in the future, is a study of multi-track diplomacy, which is the diplomacy, as I understand it from some academics, the diplomacy of the future when the formal track cannot achieve peace. And I think we haven't talked about that because of, for whatever reason, we've been talking about the histories of the countries, et cetera, which has been fascinating to me. But I would suggest that as you go forward, that one of the lessons, irrespective of ultimately how this peace treaty came out, irrespective of the fact that Korea was not at the table and perhaps it should have been, irrespective of the fact that China was not at the table and perhaps it should have been, what Roosevelt did was he took the warring parties as they were. He did not impose his view on the warring parties. He tried to influence them, clearly by back-channel diplomacy, but he acceded to their view, which was we will negotiate directly, no other power will be at the table. He did that, and as a result, they ended at least the war and the killing. And I think that that legacy in itself is important for the nations. And I know that Japan, for one, has used that legacy in Cambodia, has used that legacy in Sri Lanka to help resolve disputes. And I hope that process for peace is something that you will study further.
Well, I rather would comment on general things relating to our discussions. I would say that I concentrate my notes into 4 brief points and deliver it to it. First of all, I would say that the 2 days discussions made a very encouraging impression on me because that was a rare case that the presenters they gave up attempts to project the abstract schemes they have painted in their heads to realities. Rather, they were trying to examine realities and then to build scheme which, thanks to that, are becoming more persuasive. The second point is actually prompted by the 2 days, 2 presentations and wonderful comments by Professor Mary. I would define it like this. Lack of clarity is not necessarily bad. I would say that Professor Iria, sitting opposite to me, he was, if not the first Western scholar who noticed that the Cold War came to Asia very late. Asia was the last region where Cold War was structured. And that was, in my view, due to lack of clarity. Therefore, when discussing remote impacts of Portsmouth Treaty, we should neither praise the treaty nor attack it, because it was as it was. It was not perfect, but it was not too bad. In all cases, that would be destroyed by World War II. And the system which emerged after World War II somehow psychologically and politically may be related to the Portsmouth Treaty, but we should have a very clear understanding that it was structured from the empty place. Another even more important thing is that it was not exactly structured. In major respects, it was self-structured system. So because major powers, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union, were strongly, aggressively opposing each other, it provided freer hands to smaller nations. And as soon as smaller nations became stronger, or at least richer, they started to structure the system they wanted, apart from major powers. This is why when we discuss the issues of regionalism, and some American or Russian skeptics say that there is no proper regionalism in Eastern Asia, my guess is that probably there is no clear vision of what Asian regionalism should be in their heads, because Asian regionalism is something very real. It does exist. But the fact is, it does not resemble the European regionalism or regionalism in any other world. So I think we should be very calm and serious about examining the reality. The reality would prompt generalization, not vice versa. The fourth point deals with the question raised by Ambassador Toga when he said we should distinguish between East Asian regionalism or Asia-Pacific regionalism. I would also say that we need to distinguish between formal regionalism and criminal informal regionalism. Otherwise, we would fail to understand what is happening between Russia, Japan, China, and Korea in reality. What we see there is strongly internationalized, transnationalized cooperation between criminal companies, criminal corporations in all the four countries. And we know that gold smuggling and fishery products smuggling and timber smuggling, all that produce extraordinary amount of money which strongly affects local authorities in all countries. And when discussing the prospect for territorial something between the two nations, we should also have in mind that there is such thing as the impact of local authorities on the process of decision making. And the criminal structures, they are very active and they know how to influence. For instance, we noticed recently that some Russian governors, they disappear someday in a very unclear circumstances, some catastrophic happening. And this is how they react to attempts by federal governments to make the situation more transparent, more clear. So another point is situation in Korea. I was a unique experience of visiting North Korea 3 months ago, together with some Americans and South Koreans. And by the way, then we discussed the possibility, theoretical possibility, of intervention by China or by Russia and China in North Korea in some emergency situation. And what was remarkable that all South Korean colleagues were energetically against that. They said that would be insulting for Koreans. So my guess is if we should consider any possibility for intervention there, we should let them, I mean North Koreans, to indicate we would agree with China or Russia or somebody else intervention. In all other cases, we should probably invite India or somebody distant to intervene if they're crazy enough. Finally, that refers to Vladimir Ivanov's presentation, and I agree with what commentator said, that speaking of bright economic perspectives in the region, we should hardly overestimate, well, the realistic possibilities to improve the situation in general. Because my guess is, after examining Soviet-Japanese economic relations for 20 years, I know that we have in economy economic cooperation right to the extent we want to have it. If Japanese were really interested in economic cooperation with Russia, they would press their government. If Russians see how to explain to themselves, to the government, to the public, why economically we should make a concession to Japan, they would have done it. So the problem is we are speaking, you know, it's all wishful thinking. This is not to say that economic cooperation is not important. This is not to say we should not cooperate. We should cooperate. But this is a very long and slow process. That's it. Thank you.
I wanted to pick up on your invitation to suggest what do you do next. Having listened to all of the discussion over 2 days and read the papers and looking at what do we have as we conclude this meeting, it seems to me we have two things. First of all, you have a model case study, which is in some ways almost unique, about a specific period in time in which you had relationships between certain states that devolved to conflict, and then you had a peace made. And you had a formal rearrangement of the international surroundings and arrangements that, in fact, did last for quite some time, albeit in an evolving way. Now, I would simply suggest that what I heard in the 2 days here was a series of discussions about what it took to create that condition or to get through that process. And I think it's worth thinking about whether or not you cannot construct some kind of a model for the people who will be studying, undergraduate students of international relations, around this particular set of circumstances that does help them understand a little bit of reality about what it really means to conduct diplomacy and to have a diplomatic solution to conflict. It's not often happened. And the reason I'll suggest that this may be relevant is that I was a part of the Camp David peace process. One of my tasks when I was part of that was to go and research the Treaty of Portsmouth. What had the Americans done? This was when we were getting ready to invite Mr. Begin and Mr. Sadat to Camp David. What had Mr. Roosevelt done? What was this all about? Now, not surprisingly, of course, the State Department, which never thinks more than 2 weeks ahead of behind, and had no files, it took us some time to go and research this. But it was, in fact, a model in many respects. And I think there is something to be said here, as I listened to these papers, about the fact that we heard everything of discussion from what role do images of the parties of each other play in setting the context? What about the real power relationships? They do matter. Timing matters. And each of these elements has been touched on one way or another here. The other thing that is quite clear is that people matter. Creativity, willingness to take political risk, all of these things about the parties who are involved in a situation at a given time matter. And I think it's important, frankly, to a generation of younger people in particular who are used to quite cynical discussions of what motivates people in any given situation, and where almost none of this is ever brought together, to give them perhaps an example. And I think this is actually quite a good case study. The other observation is really about, I suppose, the history. I took away from the discussions of all of the people who've participated and from the papers that whether we can trace a direct lineage of this particular issue today back to 1905 or 1903 or 1898 isn't really the point. The reality is we are all still living with pieces of this puzzle, and with things that were shaped in many ways in this time in a particular way that have affected people as they have looked at their options throughout the last century, and probably to some extent even today. And so I don't think it's in the least wrong to say that history does matter too. How people got where we are today is an important element of how they define the options for tomorrow. And I think that this is, simply a lesson that you can take away from the discussions if you put these papers together and then begin to draw out some of the themes that I heard from many of these papers. And I guess just a final point of observation is that I've had some discussions with a number of people here where I would say in particular what is striking about all of this particular moment and this particular conference is that a tremendous number of people have looked very seriously into many, many varied aspects of why this came about and how it came about. it's worth pulling this together and seeing then, on someone's part, what do we distill out of this? You know, what is the model for making a negotiated settlement? What are the things of history that seem to endure, and what are the things that are sloughed off and really become irrelevant? It seems to me that, in short, Treaty of Portsmouth is a very good commemorative moment to think about how some of these things can affect the way we conduct our business today and the way we look at many of the issues that we face today. So, thanks very much.
I think those are all extremely useful thoughts. I really do think that the fact that it is exactly 100 years gives us an opportunity, and it's probably an opportunity we're not going to see again. 105 and 110 and 120 are just not very round numbers, so this is really our opportunity to do it. I had mentioned how I thought that it was unfortunate, and I guess Chuck mentioned also that neither Korea nor China were actually present at the Portsmouth Treaty and they were shut out. To some extent, I think we've paralleled that in the way we've set up this conference as well, and maybe that's a hole that needs to be plugged in some way, although, to be quite honest, we worked very hard to plug that hole for our conference also in Tokyo, and it was very, very complicated to find people who were able to really do what we thought was competent work in the area. We did okay in the end, but it was really hard going for a while there. But it's something to keep in mind if you want to be able to cover that, cover those extra angles, which I think are worth covering, especially if you're going to look at the contemporary regional issues as well. Kitaoka Sensei's comment about can you have a region with a superpower in it brings me back to my question about building regions without the United States in it, which I think that most Americans would, or American diplomats would have a little bit of problem with not being included in this process. The other question is, in the case of Portsmouth, we really did have Roosevelt take a very strong leadership role. And if we're looking in terms of who's going to take a leadership role at the present to build some kind of a region, where are we going to find that kind of leadership? And that I think is a very open question.
I'd like to kind of pick up on things that almost everyone has been speaking about here in this session. First, Charles Doliak's remarks bring me back to my first intervention when I suggested that there's a history that hasn't been much constructed here at the table. It's been more of the constructive history. If you've read David's paper, you know the distinction I'm referring to. And clearly there is a history of peace. I mean, there are scholars now actively writing the history of peace. The connection that came immediately to mind as Charles began to speak was take you back to a couple of those facts from the period, the context. The Interparliamentary Union of the early 20th century was being funded completely by Norway's Storting at that point in time. Norway had already developed a kind of peace political culture that came out of the effort to peacefully separate itself from Sweden at the end of the 19th century. It seems to me there's connections between that period and that Norway's role in that period and the role Norway has played in recent years in terms of acting as the mediator, bringing together the warring parties and working for peace. So it seems to me that we should think about what we decide are the important events that construct the narrative sequence. And if we're looking for leaders who are going to make peace, we have to teach young people that peace is possible. And this is how peace has been made in various parts of the world. and perhaps this is provocative, but I'll refer you to an article by an Ohio State scholar summarizing a book of his called The Remnants of War, a recently published book, but the article was published in the New Republic in May of this year, titled The End of War ? But he publishes very convincing evidence that we're in a period, perhaps the most peaceful period in any kind of recent centuries, that war is on the decline, that threats between states are on the decline, that peacekeeping efforts, and here he cites a RAND Corporation study of UN peacekeeping efforts, are in the main successful, that much of what we hear here in the United States, which I would argue is currently the center of world militarism, is in fact framed within a history that sees the past as nothing but a sequence of wars and preparation for the next war, rather than the possibility that a new world order made more peaceful by people who have embraced the idea that peace is possible and have made peace is actually emerging. And so I think that's one of the things we could do. Think about locating this event in a different constructed historical narrative that picks up on some of what seems to be current characteristics in the international order.
Right, thanks very much. I just like to make 2 points. One is something that's been really bothering me for many, many years, which is to do with Japan's conception of itself as a power. And essentially, my special period is pre-war period, and particularly around this Russo-Japanese War and the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. And it occurred to me that the Japanese, although the Japanese were included, for example, at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 as the fifth great power in the world, the Japanese self-conception of great powership was actually very regional. And I can't help but think that self-conception actually continued right into the 1930s and 40s. Maybe some of you may disagree with this point, but I think it's a lot to do with the self-perception of oneself as a power. And that determines a lot of national interests and how that relates to either regional issues or the international framework in which the power operates. And then this leads to the second issue, which is to do with the definition of regional power and global power. If one were if a state is a global power, then obviously one of the major reasons for attaining this position or special status is the ability to manage international system together with other global powers. And one question that I don't know if Professor Kitaoka might be one of the best people to answer this, is the awareness of the Japanese state as a global power. How aware is it? How far do their interests expand in terms of looking at international issues? And also, I think we've been talking about Northeast Pacific region or East Asia region, but in effect, if the powers that we've been discussing about, Japan, China, Russia, and the United States, these are huge global powers. So although we're talking about a particular region, just because these four powers happen to, meet there, sort of geographically, so to speak. But in fact, whatever happens in Northeast Pacific area amongst these powers will have global impact. So I think we got to sort of have this connectivity between regionalism and internationalism or globalism, whatever you want to call it, because I think it's a very relevant and important issue.
We are approaching the end of this conference, and let me speak at the end of this meeting. Yesterday we talked about Katsura-Harriman Agreement. My comment is related to that. Kaneko Kentaro's material was left in the Japanese diplomatic document archive. According to that, Harriman came to Tokyo and signing the Katsura-Harriman agreement. And I think the document was related to right after that point in time. Kaneko didn't come to Portsmouth. He stayed in New York. When he was in New York, the cousin of President Roosevelt, I think, was Montgomery Roosevelt. He came. He was an executive of a Morgan conglomerate corporate group. He came to Kaneko saying that Harriman is in Tokyo. We are willing to loan Morgan's money, so we want Japan to use it. And he said this to Kaneko, and he heard of it. And the agreement was prepared. Considering this situation as an American financial group connection of Komura, Kaneko, Roosevelt, and Morgan corporate group. And behind Harriman is a Jacob Schiff. And there's a Jacob Schiff's financial group. And Takahashi Korekiyo borrowed money from Schiff. So one is a Morgan Bank, the other one is Schiff's Open Credit Group. So those two were competing severely in the U.S. financial or banking industry. And that happened to be reflected eventually in revoking the Taft-Harriman agreement. In connection to this, Jacob Schiff came to Tokyo. It was in 1906. He was welcomed by Japanese. He had the audience to the Meiji Emperor, and he was given a special decoration. And he took his family to Tokyo, and he had a good time. Yesterday, I talked about this. On his way back to the States, the daughter of Takahashi Korekiyo, Wakiko, she was only 15 years old, and Schiff took Wakiko with him to the States, and she spent 3 years in New York at high school. Wakiko later got married to the seventh son of Okubo Toshihiko. Toshimichi, rather. And Takahashi family and Jacob Schiff's family. They changed the family name to Warwife, but there's still contact between Takahashi family and former Schiff family, even up to now. Until the end of Pacific War, partly because of Jacob Schiff being Jewish, Japan was not able to disclose this kind of information. But this is really the living cultural heritage. shown by these family interactions.
松村先生、もう
Excuse
セッションの終わ
me,
りにな
we
りま
have
すから
to finish this session, so please wrap up. So I like to value this highly.
Any final comments? Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, one real quick one, and that is, and it's really more procedural than anything else, and that is that, and I may get some bricks thrown in my direction because of the suggestion, but that if possible to incorporate along with the papers, most of which will have to undergo some kind of revision, at least the main comments of the commentators, because there have been some extraordinarily fine sets of commentary.
We should have an audio record, I believe, of the conference, so we will try to distill the comments that have been made. Yeah. Okay. All right, well, thank you very much, and we'll see you at 5 o'clock over in the Wheelock room. And thank you again for all the presenters and discussants and moderators, and appreciate all your efforts.